Well, I would like to welcome you to the second panel of our conference, and this panel is entitled Bridging the Gap, the Contributions of Universities in Global Policymaking. For those of you who heard the first session, I think you'd agree that we just heard a brilliant discussion and debate over the global challenges that the United States and the world will face in the years and decades to come, and I think that we should give our panelists a second round of applause and thank them because that was terrific. I also want to take this time to thank someone who has yet to be thanked yet, and that is Jim Lindsay, who has taken what was essentially a few ideas that a few people had and crafted and constructed an absolutely amazing program and has just done terrific things in the short time he's been here. And so I want to thank Jim for his leadership and the great start he's gotten off to, and to say how terrific it is to have you here doing this. So if we could thank Jim Lyndon. Now, as we heard, globalization poses both threats and opportunities. And the challenges, the policy choices we make now and in the future will determine how these unfold. But how confident are we in the institutions responsible for making these decisions? As a nation, are we prepared for the road ahead? I think the first panel has convinced us that we face hard and difficult choices, and it requires thoughtful, reflective discussion and analysis. We need people with skills, we need people with understanding of the complex issues so that we can navigate this uncertain world. Few of these challenges, from global public health to technology to the changing nature of governance to international financial issues, few of these issues fits narrowly into the partisan lens of the often bitter political debates that we see coming from our nation's capital. So where will the answers be found? Where can thoughtful discussion take place, and where can the needed skills and knowledge be acquired? The obvious candidate, of course, are our institutions of learning and higher education. Our major research universities contain vast reservoirs of knowledge and talent that can be applied to understanding this new world. Of course, they also train and educate millions of students, not just Americans, but citizens from around the world, from just about every country on the globe. Now, just look at a university like our own university here in Texas. Where else, in one place, could you find cutting-edge knowledge on every important region in the world? Information about energy production and its effect on the environment, backgrounds on the comparative legal and governmental systems of various countries, and insight into the workings of modern finance, just to pull a few examples out of the air. Only here at a university. Yet, as we'll hear today, the modern American research university is not without its own set of challenges as we move forward. Universities, sadly, can often be hidebound places, overly bureaucratic and stovepiped, divorced from the real world, and strangely unwilling to reward true innovation and efforts to bridge disciplines and other gaps. The structure of the modern research university largely came into being in a completely different historical era, the late 19th century through the 1960s and 70s. And unlike our other major American public and private institutions, have gone through surprisingly few fundamental changes in the past 2 or 3 decades. Yet I think there is little doubt that change is needed. One only has to look abroad to see the challenges we face. Last year, China graduated twice as many university students as the United States, a trend that's only going to continue. As a result of the difficulties with visas and restrictions on mobility, the share of top graduate students coming to the United States has fallen precipitously, and the best science and engineering talent often goes elsewhere. These are just 2 challenges, and the list of challenges facing the modern American research university goes on and on. I think we would all agree that if we don't get the issue of higher education right, our ability to meet the challenges identified during the first panel are doomed. Now, fortunately, we have a terrific group on this panel to help us think through these issues. All 3 of our experts bring fresh perspectives and innovative thinking to these questions based on rich experience. Perhaps even more importantly, all 3 are great Longhorns, dedicated to seeing both the Strauss Center and UT succeed in this crucial area. Now, everybody here knows that Admiral Bob Inman has had a storied career in the private sector, government, and higher education. And instead of going through his long and distinguished biography, the key thing for this audience to know is that during the past few years, Bob has been the most articulate and forceful advocate in getting UT to think through and create innovative educational and research blueprints needed for UT to meet the global challenges of the 21st century. He has been unwavering in his support and advocacy to get people around UT to think about these issues. And everything global and good on this campus has his fingerprints on it, and for that we are grateful. Jim Langdon is another one of our triple threats, achieving great things in all three sectors. Frankly, I think Jim Lindsay would agree with me that without Jim, we would not be here today. It was his vision and energy that got the Strauss Center started, and it's his commitment and his ideas that will guarantee that we succeed. And it's amazing to note that while he was doing all this in the past couple of years for UT and the Strauss Center, he's held numerous other positions, including chairing the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and helped running a premier global law firm. Finally, Terri Givens is one of the rising stars in the world of global higher education. In addition to a very distinguished scholarly career, Terri founded and built UT's Center for European Studies. And in her current position as Vice Provost, she is now responsible for leading UT's efforts into global education and research, and already has made great progress in creating a long overdue undergraduate program in international studies. I've asked each of the panelists to provide brief remarks, and then we will have what I hope to be a lively discussion with the audience. Without further ado, I turn it over to our Vice Provost, Terri.
Thanks, Frank. As you mentioned, one of the important things to keep in mind is that universities in general have a great wealth of resources, and that is one of the things we want to tap into when we think about our internationalization process. And as I look at the challenges for UT in the coming years, they come from several directions, as Frank has already noted. In my travels and talking to administrators from other universities in Latin America and so on, especially in Latin America, they point out the fact that more of their students are going to Europe than they are to the United States. About 60% of their students who grow abroad are going to the United States. And for example, when I was discussing this with some university officials from Costa Rica, they really want more of their students to go to the United States, but they don't necessarily see the advantage of an education in the United States over one in Europe. But there's also the issue of strategic alliances, and that's where I'm putting a lot of my emphasis is on trying to develop more of these strategic alliances with other universities, with other entities. And I see the university as having two main roles. One is to provide opportunities for faculty and students on the international front for a variety of reasons. Faculty benefit from research collaborations, from having, and not that these don't exist, but through creating these institutional connections, we can hopefully provide more resources through creating relationships with broader entities. If you think of the Mexico example, creating relationships with their version of something like the NSF, so that we can get more funding for faculty and graduate student collaborations. For students, and one thing I want to point out is that often when we talk about internationalization or providing more opportunities for students, the focus is on study abroad. Well, study abroad is very important, but it's not the only answer. We want to provide more opportunities for internships. We want to provide more opportunities for undergraduate research, and also opportunities for students to play a role in some of the most urgent issues of our time, which unfortunately I wasn't here for the first panel, but presume that's what some of the discussions were about. HIV, AIDS in Africa, scientific exchange and technology training. And for many of these countries, simply English training is an important factor because many of the teachers who will be teaching English need more training and so on. And so when I'm meeting with these other university officials, we often have some kind of student exchange agreement, maybe even a faculty exchange agreement, or we may, as we do in Cordoba, have an actual study abroad program there, but they want more. What they're looking for is a true collaboration with our university where we can have relationships with across the board, from engineering to computer science to literature and languages. And these are the kind of strategic alliances that we need to be creating with specific partners so that we can have deeper and more intensive relationships that provide more resources and opportunities for faculty and students. Now, but what I've also discovered is that we're in competition here. You've got consortia in Europe and from other regions that are going in, and they want to set up these kinds of arrangements with these universities. And so we have to, everybody, when I go around, Texas is seen very highly regarded. People really want to have a relationship with Texas. But that's why these broader institutional relationships are important. We can't anymore go and say, well, we want to set up a study abroad program with you. That's not necessarily going to be of benefit to that university. We have to be able to go in and say, yes, we want to have especially when we're looking at equal partners, more of a broader relationship where we provide opportunities for their faculty to come and speak at, or to be involved in our research areas and sending our faculty there and so on. But I think we can also look at, in developing countries, especially in Africa, opportunities for research, as I mentioned already, on issues such as HIV/AIDS, basic issues such as clean water, and so on. So in general, we need to focus on creating these collaborative processes, and I see myself in my position as more of a helping to facilitate these kinds of relationships. And not that faculty aren't already out there. We have a lot of faculty and people like Victoria Rodriguez who've already been out there creating a lot of these relationships. And it's very important to keep in mind that we've already got a good basis. We've got many faculty who have personal relationships that and research collaborations that are very strong. But what I found, particularly, for example, when putting together our Mexico working group, is that when you get faculty together in a room talking about the kind of work that they're doing, is that we can find synergies, that we can find ways to collaborate that maybe didn't exist before. And we are really trying to focus on that facilitation. We don't want to go out and necessarily create just new programs. We want to make sure that those are carefully tied into faculty interest, to student interest, and to make sure that we have a good, strong institutional basis for these relationships. But the thing to keep in mind is that we are in a competition, and that it is important for our students, which for a variety of reasons, to be able to have these types of opportunities. It's important for faculty to have these types of opportunities. And so we need to move forward in terms of trying to raise funds to get more students abroad, to fund faculty collaborations, to work with entities from other countries to develop collaborative research agreements, and so on. So I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you, Terri. Just quickly, how does UT stand compared to other universities?
In terms of sending students abroad, we're doing fairly well. If you look at the absolute numbers, I think we're number 3 in terms of sending students abroad. But given that I think we're at about 15% if you include all the different types of abroad types of experiences. But still, if you look at it, we could be doing a lot more. That's only, out of 15,000, out of almost 50,000 students, we're talking somewhere around 3,000 going per year. So.
Great. Excellent. Thanks. Jim?
Thanks, Frank. Well, let me just first say what a pleasure it is to be here. Like a number of the other panelists earlier and some on this panel, I spent a lot of good years here in Austin at the university, so the university is a very, very important place in my life, and it's just a thrill to be back here. I think that I'm included in this group. All these other people up here are sort of white-collar people. I'm sort of a blue-collar guy. And Jim Lindsay encouraged me to talk about some of the things in the blue-collar vein that I've seen and done over the years that bear on the Strauss Center. from my own experience. So I hope you won't think that I'm too self-indulged when I go through some of these things. But I think there's some lessons about the matters that Terry's been talking about, how we get around the world, how we do these things in a better way that are at the center of the concept of the Strauss Center. I really believe that what one needs to do is to leverage knowledge. And that's very different from collecting information. Leveraging knowledge is really hard to do. Most of us, given a choice, would find ourselves more comfortable doing those things that we know how to do, doing them in an environment in which we're comfortable doing it, and with the base of knowledge that we already have. And then you can give your opinions to whoever asks for those opinions in a very methodical way. And I know that in the context of my law firm, whether I'm talking to a litigator or a regulatory lawyer or a deal lawyer, labor lawyer, it doesn't much matter. You start describing a set of facts to them, and, well, my gosh, that's a litigation issue. You go to the labor lawyer and the same set of facts, well, that's a labor issue. I mean, everybody wants to see things through the lens that they already know and they already understand. And it is a very, very difficult challenge to get people with discrete knowledge to work with others with other knowledge and see where those two sets of worlds come together and what additional knowledge can be based upon top of that. And we sit here in this great University of Texas, and we've got silos of knowledge throughout the campus. And over time, if the Strauss Center can be effective toward combining some of these forms of knowledge around the university, and then moreover, as Terri was describing, taking some of this and working relationships around the world with other institutions, with exchange programs and the like, you know, we really have a chance, I think, over time to expand what we know and how we think. And I think that is really important. My sort of globalization moment, well, there's been a couple. One was in the early 90s, and I remember I was in Baku, Azerbaijan, and we were working on an oil transaction, and the companies involved were from Italy, Houston, those are two different places, Baku, and the UK, actually Scotland, and it seems like there's one more company. So we didn't finish what we were doing on Thursday, Friday, had to stay the weekend, so we're sitting around over the weekend talking about this transaction. And the Azeri fellow was about my age, but looked 15 years older, gold teeth, you know, poor health, smoked cigarettes constantly. The Italian guy was in an Armani suit, and the Houston guy was wearing boots, and the UK guy was just being a UK guy, and I was there. What was interesting is that everybody had, I mean, completely different life experiences. But when it came to talking about the geology of this field and what needed to happen, no one outranked anybody else. The Italian guy would come up with some very highfalutin concept about what we needed to do with the field, and this little Azeri guy would look at him and say, we already tried to do that, it didn't work, and would explain why. And everybody else around the table would go, okay, I get that. And so, you know, any preconception you had by looking at somebody across the table was gone after a weekend of doing this. And everybody learned a lot. And then the other interesting thing is somebody would try to tell a joke. Keep in mind, all this is being translated. Italian was being translated into Russian, Russian being translated into English and Italian. And so it was a sort of a laborious process. But anybody that tried to tell a joke around the table, they would no more than get halfway through it and everybody already heard the joke. And so in some ways, you know, the world is pretty small. But it was a very, very interesting moment for me, and I began to understand that the world was getting very much smaller. And through a collaboration of these people over a period of time, I mean, it took a long time, but a project was put together, and it was successful. I'll give you one more example where this had an impact on me, and this was a few years later, and it involved a Russian oil company by the name of Lukoil. And we were representing Lukoil at the time. And Lukoil at that time was partially owned by the Russian government. And it was very asset-rich and very cash-poor. And if they'd been in the United States, we would have wanted to do a capital markets transaction, a debt offering, probably a convertible bond offering. And so we talked to the Russians about doing that. Well, there were a couple problems. One, under Russian law, there was no process for convertible bond offerings. There was no process for securities at all. And the second problem was that Lukoil didn't have any financial statements, not present or past. And so the challenge was, is it possible to do a capital markets transaction with no law and no financial statements? And, you know, and if just in our law firm, we would not have ever figured out how to do this, but with some able-bodied Russians, some other Europeans, you know, well, the idea was that we could get Yeltsin to issue a decree that would allow for a convertible debt offering. And it was poorly written, but it was a fig leaf of enough of law that we could get this done, and that we would list in the prospectus that that there were no financial statements. I mean, forget in the day of Sarbanes-Oxley when you've got to make sure every number and everything. We had none, and the prospectus said we had none. But what we had were, you know, decades of operating experience. You know, the production, the wells, had geological information from whatever, and we had an international partner who was willing to buy a third of the securities. And so we went to market with that, and it sold, and it was oversubscribed. So it's one of those things where if you get enough people with good ideas and can think through things in a variety of different cultures, this could have never just been done on Wall Street. It took a variety of people from different cultures to make something happen. And so, you know, I learned that you should be challenged to walk into a room or to a meeting where you don't know everything that you need to know to get something done. And then if you're open to what you can learn from others, even in a high-stress context, you know, you will be the beneficiary of that. And so I bring all this back to the Strauss Center simply to say that hopefully over time we will have a forum here, if you will. It's a fundamental marketplace of ideas where there will be, for always, there will be strong academics, but there will be partnerships from government, participants from government, I should say, both domestic and foreign, and that we will have some people from the business community, both domestic and foreign, that can exchange ideas, talk about projects, talk about issues, talk about policy, and then with this great university to have the resources available to blend in to that framework. And as Terri and Frank know, we've got an incubator project, I guess is what we'd call it, with MGIMO, the Russian Public Policy School. They're very excited about this, and so if we can bring in some of the international aspects to this, I think it could be a very, very exciting possibility over many years to come. We're at the beginning of it, thanks to people like John Brumley, who's sitting right out here, an old client, old friend. But I think we have, we've got a great future, and so.
Knowledge instead of collecting information. I think we have another motto for a T-shirt there. That exactly sums up just beautifully, I think, one of the things we're trying to do. But one of the challenges we face is the academic world resists that kind of change at times. The stovepiping that you mentioned, the idea of the kind of individual scholar with his or her idea of how things work. I wonder, given that you've seen whole industries, companies, organizations go through the painful transformation from collecting information or doing their thing to actually leveraging knowledge. If there was 2 or 3 pieces of advice you would give, lessons learned from either the private sector or the governmental sector, because clearly the university world is going to have to do this. It's not going to be easy. What kind of things should we be thinking about as we move forward?
Well, Frank, I don't know that I have advice on that subject. I know this. You say it's hard for university to do this. It's hard for anybody to do this. It's hard for me to do it. I mean, in my daily life. I mean, how often do you change your routine during the day? I mean, you get used to doing things a certain way, and you continue doing them that way. And we all fall into that trap. We read the same kind of books that we've been reading before, and But you just have to find a way to challenge yourself to look at things in a different way. And I think at a great university like Texas, it's incumbent upon the administration and on the faculty to look at themselves and say, how do we get out of just doing things the same way? How do we challenge ourselves to take the knowledge we have and to leverage it? And this is an unfair example. I use it all the time. But if you were I won't say it, come to think of it, but if you were the master of a certain discrete sort of curriculum here at the university, where you would be at the top of that apex if you had read all the literature and read all the poetry from that particular country, I mean, you know, you've got sort of a reason to not want to expand it, because you know everything there is to know and you are the expert. But sometimes if you look beyond that and say, what could this bit of knowledge do if it were combined with 3 or 4 other discrete forms of knowledge? What might we have? And I just think it's a matter that's got to be continually challenged. I think the Strauss Center has got an excellent shot at being able to do that. An excellent shot at being able to do that.
Great. That's terrific advice. Thank you, Jim. Admiral Inman?
Frank, I'm going to spend some time on history because I think it does help everyone understand. Some here certainly know how we got to this point, but it also brings together 2 different issues. I'm not an expert on academia. I spent 31 years in the government. I've been in the private sector for 25 years. Much of those energies go into the venture capital world. I began pro bono team teaching a graduate course, Bob Strauss, Charles Walker, Howard Beasley, and then John Connolly, replacing him, on perspectives on public policy. And then to my great surprise was approached in 2001 to take tenure slot in the Johnston Chair. In '84, then Secretary of State George Shultz asked me to chair a bipartisan panel looking at the terrorist threats to U.S. embassies around the world. This came after the terrorist bombings of our embassies in Kuwait and Beirut. It was a wonderful group to work with, but we delved deeply into, at that point, the state of terrorist threats that we faced around the world. I'm blamed for the ugly buildings that have been built around the world in the subsequent years as one element of that outcome. But when 9/11 happened, and suddenly all over the country there were people who wanted to know more about the terrorist threat, they Googled, and up my role in the Commission on the Security of Embassies pops up. And so I was suddenly faced with an array of speaking requests all over the country. Tried to fulfill as many of them as I could. What I wasn't prepared for was, at every one of them, I would end up being asked, well, Admiral, what role should the U.S. play in the world? I spent my life looking at the outside world, not defining what the U.S. ought to do in that world. So I came back and frustrated with that experience. Spent a lot of time talking to Elspeth Rostow and Frank Gavin. And they encouraged me to put together an ad hoc group. The Dean of Graduate Studies, Dean Rostow, then the deans at that point of law, liberal arts, LBJ School, the provost, the librarian of the LBJ Library, all agreed to join this ad hoc group. And with some good wise advice, I asked Bill Powers to co-chair it. And we began meeting sort of monthly. And when we started out, I divided it into 2 different areas. What should we teach? And how could we start a dialogue? And the idea initially was to get a dialogue on campus about the U.S. role in the world, and then in the region, and then that work to spread it larger. Bill Powers is an activist. He wanted to sort of put that to a test pretty quickly, and we settled on what if we had an oil crisis in the Middle East. So we dutifully set off to try to put together a dialogue on the campus that we could then bring in people from the private sector to take part in it. We found a lot of people with knowledge about a country or an entity, but very little effort to think about policies, particularly international policies. What would you do? So we weren't making much progress on putting that together, but I had a group of graduate students, a mix of law, public affairs, and graduate business, who had in fact tackled that issue. So I broke out the results of their efforts, shared it with the panel, and they encouraged, well, let's use that as the basis and go do a dialogue. And we got the then chief operating officer of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson, to come be a part of it. He came skeptically, but at the end of it concluded that it was entirely feasible in an academic setting to bring together a variety of talent to help understand all the potential elements of a policy, and that would be useful to the private sector people interacting in the process. So that gave us a shove down the road toward what has become the Strauss Center, and a variety of other efforts across the campus as well, accelerating a relook at what do we teach? Are we preparing our students here to effectively deal in a global world in the process? Are we doing all we could do to help them? And that's helped drive a lot of looks at curriculum, how you change it, what you try to do. The Strauss Center turns out to be a place where these elements come together. While the teaching won't take part inside the Strauss Center, we hope it will both attract great teachers and influence their participation in various colleges across the campus, but that it will be the locus for research, specifically studying the kinds of issues that we had to turn to an ad hoc group of students to do because we couldn't find it anywhere else on the campus at that critical point. But finally, I hope it will also serve as the locus for the dialogue. What role should the U.S. play in the world? And the locus where we bring in academicians from other institutions, where we bring in people from the government, critically, and people from the private sector to look at specific issues and to help advise the country. What role should the U.S. play in the world?
Terrific. Our panelists have given us, I think, an enormous amount to work with, and I'm going to open it up to questions soon, and we've changed the format a little bit. Leslie has the microphone, so if anybody wants to ask a question, just raise your hand. She'll come over. I do want to ask one question that touches on something that came from the first panel. The first panel, if there was a common theme, it was Harvard. Everybody was from Harvard and how great Harvard was. And I want to hear your reflections, your ideas, your advice for Texas. What opportunities does Texas have to be different? What strategies should Texas pursue? If my original sort of presumption that the university world is in a state of great change, things could be much different 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, there should be great change, what are the opportunities?
Let me be narrow-minded but also blunt on that issue. When I started trying to respond to this, what role should the U.S. play in the world? Before I came back to focus here, I looked at what was happening on the West Coast. I'm a longtime member of the Pacific Council on Foreign Affairs. I looked at the Northeast, from Washington to Boston. I found there were a lot of people who had ideas already formed, and they were willing to go sell those ideas that they'd had for a long time. but I couldn't find any place where they were taking what I thought was a completely fresh look, not bound by a position they'd already taken that they had to sell or to maintain. And so I had the sense that we had the great advantage here of being open, not already committed with positions to defend, but probably more importantly, as the country has changed, the voting power has moved in substantial measure toward the middle of the country. And so we had the prospect that if we could take fresh look and shape ideas, that we had a pretty substantial political base that could take up and implement those.
Jim, did you have thoughts?
Well, I've told this story in the past, and you've heard it before, but I have an acquaintance, a very wealthy New Zealander who lives in Dubai, and the investor all over the world, and his thing is transparency in government, transparency in sovereign wealth funds. I mean, he is transparency obsessed and wants to create an institution to further transparency around the world. And I talked to him on a recent trip to Dubai about the Strauss Center being, you know, an ideal vehicle to look at these issues. And he looked. He said, "That's really interesting." You know, he said, "I don't think I could get Harvard and Yale," and he went through the list to buy into this. But, you know, he says Texas, and this is a guy from New Zealand. He says Texas. You know, maybe they're entrepreneurial enough to really take an idea like this and do something with it. I could be interested in that. So I think, you know, there is entrepreneurism in education. There's lots of room for entrepreneurism in education. And not teaching about entrepreneurism, but teaching everything with an entrepreneurial spirit. And I think that's one of the great assets that Texas has.
Yeah, I would agree with those two comments, and just add that, I mean, as a university, we do have a great reputation and can build on that. But again, we because we have a lot of fresh, we aren't within the Beltway, we aren't in the classic places where these kinds of issues are discussed. Not that we don't discuss them here, but we do have the opportunity here to take a fresh look at some of these issues. And I think the leadership we have in the Strauss Center and other parts of campus, you have a great opportunity to really push things forward on various agendas.
I just wanted to make a comment. A few weeks back, I was at a meeting in Canada with a group of my counterparts, of graduate deans from China, Australia, Canada, and the U.S. And the reason we got together is to see to discuss really what was our responsibility as graduate deans to prepare better our graduates to meet the challenges of the 21st century, like the Strauss Center. And really what the discussion was all about is that we're not doing a terribly good job of preparing our graduates for government or for the private sector, and specifically for industry. That we are overly focused on our comfort zone, which is to prepare our PhDs to be professors and to be researchers, and that we really need to do a better job of expanding their career horizons. It was also the discussion a lot about the partnerships that are being forged between industry and universities, and between the private sector and between government. And we have some on campus, but far less than we should, being especially, as you are right, we are entrepreneurial, and you're right, you know, Harvard and Yale would find it more difficult to get out of their comfort academic zone. So I think we have a wonderful opportunity here, and I hope that the Strauss Center, Jim and Frank and those of you that are exercising leadership positions within the Strauss Center will really make it the focus on campus where
industry and government and academics can get together to forge these partnerships that really are where we ought to be preparing more of our PhDs and of our master students and of our graduate students, rather than, like I said, just to be professors that know very well their literature and that don't want to get out of their comfort zone.
Victoria, that's a terrific point, and that's spot on. And I'll let the panelists give their views, but you'd be very interested to know about one of our flagship programs at the Strauss Center that we're going to be starting up that we call Bridging the Gap. And in fact, we're very lucky that these two gentlemen here on this panel are going to co-chair it. The idea being that if you look at globalization and you look at the issues discussed during the first panel, who are the people really on the forefront of that? There are people in government, there's people in academics, but there's people in the private sector. And Jim's story about oil in energy in Central Asia gets right to that. Where could you find that kind of knowledge outside of the private sector? And I think it's incumbent upon us as a university to find a way to partner more effectively with the private sector, to bring them into the classroom, to bring them into contact with students. Because the point is, you're absolutely right, we are training these kids to do that. We're not training them, you know, some will become professors like us, but the fact of the matter is, most people, as undergraduates and even graduate students, go on to do things in the governmental and private sector, and they are going to be at the forefront of these issues of globalization. We need to do a much better job of helping them think about it, and one of the ways we need to do that is by making people from the private sector feel comfortable in the university. And I think, you know, it's not unfair to say, it's fascinating when you talk to people from the private sector. They get this, they want to be involved, they're willing to give their time, their resources, their expertise. They just need to be asked, and a forum needs to be created that makes them feel comfortable. There is some cultural difference, right? And it's incumbent upon us to make them feel comfortable. And this Bridging the Gap program, which is supported with a generous grant from the Ford Foundation, is, as far as I can tell, unlike anything anyone else is doing. The point is to go into the private sector, have conversations, meet with CEOs and other people from large corporations, ask them what are the issues in globalization we should be teaching in our classroom, what kind of knowledge should we be bringing in, what kind of research questions we should be asking, and seeing how we can engage them. So, you know, this is both to say it's a great question and a great point, and this is something that is a real priority for the Strauss Center. It's a program we're going to get started very soon.
Frank, as the microphone moves to another questioner, may I add a footnote to it for mine? This effort is going to require a lot more collaboration across campus, collaboration between colleges, between departments in the process. And we've had sort of a mixed reaction. We've had some places we've gotten wonderful support, willingness to participate. We've had others who've sort of standing off still at this stage of the game. And so we really do have to, as a university, think through incentives. How do we create the incentives that will help facilitate this collaboration across the stovepipes? We're not there yet.
Frank, just one point, if I might, on that. You know, just doing international business around the world in places like Central Asia for the time that I have, it's clear that, you know, when American business goes to these places, they take lawyers that are educated at fine schools, they take engineers that are educated at fine schools, they take MBAs that are educated from fine schools, and when it comes to the geopolitics of the region and how all that impacts what we're trying to do, we're all just left to make it up on our own. I mean, engineers, lawyers, you know, and the like, and there isn't anybody that really knows what they're talking about sitting at the table. And so, you know, my dream one day is, why can't there be people from the LBJ school, you know, and educated in the geopolitics of the world? Admiral Inman and I had a very fascinating discussion about how things often start with just geography and landscape, where mountain ranges are, where oceans are, you know. And if I had to ask this room, where Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan and all those and how they fit in proximity to Iran and what implications all that means for all of us, even in this group, I doubt that the scores would be that high. And then when you drill down a little deeper and say, well, what do the Turkmenis care about vis-a-vis the Kazakhs, and what's the position of the Azeris, and how does that play into this role? And just to take it to a very practical level, in the oil area, in the United States, our thing is to find oil and gas in the ground. So you drill a vertical hole, and that's how you figure out where wealth is, and you collect the rents associated with that. Well, in that part of the world, the wealth isn't collected by that vertical hole. The wealth is created by the horizontal pipes that take the oil across boundaries, and that's where people collect the rents. And so the misconception about where the critical point was were things that people could have figured out very early on if they had been trained, or if they thought about the region, they thought about the geography, they thought about how to move oil in that region. But it was many billions of dollars worth of hard lessons that again, a school like this could have better educated people to play a role.
I was just commenting here, it's also a two-way street, because that historian and that geographer, it would never occur to them that ExxonMobil would be interested.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
It never occurred to them.
Absolutely.
They were in their comfort zone at the university,
Yes.
and they would have nothing to say to ExxonMobil.
Absolutely.
ExxonMobil would never be interested in them because they're so design.
But that's what we spoke about at the very beginning, how not only can an academic institution be in a comfort zone, all of us can be in a comfort zone. And so, how we break that is an interesting question, but I know the value's there. I absolutely know the value's there.
Well, Jim, as a political scientist, I'll volunteer to go on your team. But I see the same issue even as a professor in the government department, a political scientist. I mean, we have the same problem. We're training our graduate students just to be professors, with the reality being that not all of them are going to get jobs as professors. Some of them are going to go into government, some of them are going to go work for NGOs, some of them may go to work for an oil company. We have to decide as a department, what kind of opportunities do we want to provide for students who may not end up becoming professors? And I think that comes into this whole issue of innovation in teaching. How do we want to rethink these kinds of things, and which directions do we want to go in?
I want to sort of reemphasize this, because Victoria is absolutely right, but one thing we should tell our graduate students is it can also be fun, because I can honestly say in the last 2 or 3 years, interacting with Admiral Inman and Jim Langdon and other people who understand the private sector has been like a postgraduate education for me. My writing, my understanding, my teaching, my knowledge of the world is much better than it would have been if I had not had this interaction. And it's, I can go in a room with academics and I can look and I know exactly what they're going to say. And you know how it is, Victoria. You go to a conference in your particular field, you can play a guessing game, you know how the whole dynamic works. And this is a vocational set, an area of the world that brings totally different knowledge, skills, and experiences, and it makes me a much better academic. And in the same way, I'd like to think that sometimes the interaction with the academics can help the people in the private sector become better at what they do. There's only benefit that comes from this cross-fertilization.
Well, Frank, if I might stand up a second for academics, I will tell you one other little story. There's a fellow by the name of Mike Oxenberg. Jim, you may have known him, passed away recently.
Michigan.
At Michigan, head of China Studies, and a brilliant man, great friend, and the world misses him. But we worked with Mike on a transaction in China a decade or so ago, and so we had lawyers and bankers and everybody involved in this. Well, in the case of this academic, all the bankers and lawyers just kind of sat there, and Mike negotiated everything. I mean, so don't ever underestimate what a professor might be able to do. They can be stars in the business world as well, and he was one that certainly would fit that mold. So you got to be careful categorizing people because you don't know what they're capable of, and academics can do well.
Yeah, and I think that brings up the point. It's not just the graduate students. I mean, why can't our faculty be involved in some of these activities? I mean, it's again, this bridging the gap idea, I think, is great, but it has to be at all levels. The faculty, there's no reason why we can't get some expert on Turkmenistan if we had one to help out with it. Faculty do consulting type of work all the time, and as Frank has said, it's helped broaden his horizons and helped him in his teaching. And that's the thing, is we have to see this as an exchange. We're getting something out of it, you're getting something out of it. And so it doesn't have to be seen as, oh, I'm going to work for the big bad,
The microphone.
Thanks, Frank. My name is Jack Sussman. First, a quick comment. Public-private partnerships are an excellent idea, but I think there are costs as well as benefits. You really want to watch out that you don't let the private sector begin to dictate the agenda, especially if there's funding involved. And I'll come back to the funding question and leave it with you as far as that's concerned. But it seems to me that when one wants to draw different disciplines together, one creates a center. So you've already done that. So congratulations. I think that's the wave of the future, and it's been going on for some time. Actually, Brown University did a program called Choices for the 21st Century that was a multidisciplinary effort that they rolled out nationwide through the public libraries with trained speakers, and asked for input from citizens in the various public libraries around the country. And I was fortunate to be able to run town hall meetings about 10 years ago with respect to that. But coming back to the center issue, it seems that would necessitate really a three-step process. Number one, to create the center. But then number two, if you're going to get into the public policy issues, you need to be able to ask the question, what is to be done? And to go back to Admiral Inman's emphasis on incentives, I think that there is a potential conflict of interest when a center, which is the repository of open inquiry, let's say, takes a particular position. So there might be an incentive to create an offshoot from that center to really take a public policy position as to what is to be done. And then the third of three would be to answer the question, how is this to be done? And for that, you probably need an additional offshoot organization, just so there are no conflicts of interest along those lines. I had an opportunity to work in Central and Eastern Europe with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and that was basically how they set things up. Without getting into proliferation of institutions and so on, these took the form of working groups and then got the private sector involved to work with the funding issues and to align some of the interests between the public and private sector. But as a final point here, too, one doesn't want to neglect the opportunity for the international student community to provide input, and also for individuals such as myself who are lifelong learners for one reason or another, who have not been on the fast track or who are coming back into academia from the private sector and so on. So there are, as we well know, a number of different constituencies from which we can draw. Thank you. And I guess the question would be, how to fund these types of issues. Thank you.
Frank, in my usual inarticulate manner, I failed to make clear the point. We are not talking about developing the policy. And so there are already institutions that do that. We're talking about where we get people to talk and shape their own ideas about what it ought to be. They may all come together and generally agree on a position or a place that ought to be pursued. They'll find another forum to take it the next step. But it is not intended to be a replica of Council on Foreign Relations, where you come in and they tell you what you ought to think or know, or at others. It's intended to be exactly the opposite. How do you, from a bottom up, get people engaged and get them to exchange ideas in the process, and then leave having listened, hopefully, with a broader view as they go back to other things. So it is not intended to be a Hoover, at least at this stage, where you decide a position and go and present it.
Hi, my name is Kevin Cholera, and I'm an undergraduate, actually, in geography and math. And in relation to Dr. Rodriguez's point, I definitely am excited to see that we're having this type of center, and I'm really excited that we're having a center focusing on international affairs. This past year, I actually worked with a group of 10 students to organize one of UT's first seminars on global affairs called Act Local, Think Global. And we sought to connect undergraduates with graduate students and faculty that focus on international relations to get undergraduates really involved and inculcate a type of global perspective. So my question is, how does the Strauss Center or other initiatives on campus, how do y'all actually plan to engage undergraduates in these exciting opportunities?
I'll take a stab at that before turning over to the panelists. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to think about the Strauss Center, and when you think of people up on this panel, the Strauss Center, I always like to think of as the sort of the top of the spear, or the top of the sort of triangle, and sort of the university's effort to develop and expand and broaden and improve its global education and research efforts and opportunities. So we try to bring in top experts from the private sector, the government sector, from the academic sector, and make them accessible and available to undergraduates. We have events like this all the time. One of the things that we noticed a couple of years ago was that there really wasn't this kind of opportunity for undergraduates to interact with, talk, share their ideas with experts on these questions. So that would be the first major point. The second would be we are developing any number of different types of programs, from internships to those kind of things, as supporting classes, eventually some of the international partnerships that we're working with and negotiating on. Jim mentioned a very exciting one we have with MGIMO in Moscow. We fully expect those to have undergraduate curricular components. And then third, I think we stand ready to support the efforts by people like Terri, and we have Jean Goltz here, who's the director of the Masters in Global Policy Studies program, to support in any way possible these new curricular efforts. And we have an open door and are very excited about the possibility of getting undergraduates. I mean, we're not degree granting, we don't have courses, but we want to be engaged in the life of undergraduates as much as they want to have us engaged.
Hi. I found extremely valuable the idea of creating an open discussion about bridging the gap with the private sector, but this is just the very tip of the iceberg. I think the whole institution, not just UT, all universities are built in such a way that they're conducive to isolation. I have seen many people who work in fundraising for universities having such a hard time bridging this gap. I mean, the vocabulary is different when you see them saying, we have to sell this product, we have to market this, academic reacting immediately with rejection to that. And the issue of how we are not preparing our grad students to perform beyond academy may be related that the system is built in such a way that the only people training here are people who only have exclusive experience in the academy. I have seen fierce opposition when we try to recruit people who have other credentials beyond the university. How we can prepare these students to do something else if the people we're training have exclusive experience in that. So the other issue that prevents us from being more active in interacting with the private sector is the bureaucracy is designed in such a way that we cannot react fast. I mean, even to approve a project, we had such a hard time navigating through the bureaucracy that it will take a really long process to be able to be an effective partner with the private sector.
Yeah, I hope we are not misleading you. I'm thinking back to the Sussman question earlier. This is to be a forum, all of these efforts are to be a forum, where you bring together people with different experiences. One of the first things I encountered in trying to broaden this was the academician, well, I'm an expert in this area, but I don't want to get involved in policy because that would somehow corrupt the clarity with which I pursue my knowledge. I dealt with this in my government years constantly. I was supposed to talk about the outside world, not comment on what policies the U.S. was going to form to deal with it. And it was pretty frustrating, particularly as I watched inept policies evolving, because they listened to me only when I supported their preconception. And when I had something that didn't support that view, that was trash that I was bringing, clearly not worth their considering. So the challenge we have here, and this does get to the incentive issue as well, how can you get people to both bring knowledge and be willing to explore other ideas or the implication of that as a gift that they make to this broader process? What role should the U.S. play in the world? And I'm persuaded they can do that without corrupting the purity of their academic research at all. The people that we've talked to who are interested in funding some of it, they see it from, how we'd love to hire people coming in who already understand the cultural implications and as well as the business expertise, and the difficulty they have now in hiring people who bring that broader understanding of the outside world. They have to expose them in 2 to 5 years in the company before they begin to have that breadth to really perform in the world that Jim has been describing. So our optimistic hope on the teaching side is that we will end up with breadth in the curriculum. And it's going to be a time. Will it take longer to get the degree? Possibly. But it will be of more value to their potential employers when we're through.
And I've run into this issue. I mean, I run into it on a regular basis in terms of people seeing the university as, here we are in the middle of Austin, but people see the university as this closed-off entity that they can't figure out, they can't even figure out where the entrance to the university is. That's being fixed. But it's a tough issue, and I think we just have to keep pecking away at it and working on trying to develop the kinds of relationships that will help to, pull down some of those silos. I think it's just a kind of thing that's going to take time, and things like the Strauss Center should be very, very useful in helping to bring together the kinds of people who are interested in moving beyond those silos, and then hopefully that will spread out beyond into the broader university culture. But it's one of these things where there are some people who will be very much for it, there are some people who will resist, and that's just the nature of academia. We're seeing that even now with the curriculum reform that we're doing. There's some people who are very enthusiastic about it, others who are dragging their feet, and there are various reasons on each side for why they take those positions. But it's change, and change is difficult. And even the way even going back to Victoria's point about the way we train, it ties into so many different things. The way we train our graduate students, are we going to be more open to getting them the kind of training they need so that they don't need this 2 to 5 years of cultural training really in the business environment. And it's going to take a lot of work, but I think we're at least starting to make some steps in that direction.
Peter.
Peter Ward, LBJ School of Public Affairs. A drum I've been beating for several years now and having a lot of fun doing. And I would urge the Strauss Center to really, I think, take this on board, is to use much more creatively the technological facilities that we have to bridge the gap. I'm thinking of, and particularly the constituencies we've already identified, how you bridge its gaps, really. It's gaps between institutions, it's gaps between public and private sector, it's gaps between academics and activists. We can bridge those gaps in a variety of ways, and the technology that I think we need to really sort of use much more effectively. It's underused at present. Is really internet video conferencing. We should be building this into our formal teaching. That's where you can build partnerships between either they can be part of a formal partnership, institutional partnerships, or they can be formal or semi-formal faculty member to faculty member. We should be teaching our courses often in real time, jointly with other faculty members in other schools and other policy institutions. We should be having, and that could be on it could be a full semester. I've done this myself. Had a lot of fun with my students, interacting with other students at other institutions. It could be, of course, tied to our research in terms of working much more in terms of clusters of researchers, policy analysts. It could be with private sector institutions and so forth, but using the technologies that are available so that we don't have to physically get on a plane and go places. We can have these interactions on an ongoing basis. And as I say, I think we're underusing the technological facilities that, I mean, this is a privileged institution, and we are not using those technological institutions, those opportunities to the extent that we should be. You mentioned just now, Frank, that a counterpart group in Moscow. I mean, we could be having this conversation today with a counterpart group in Moscow in real time. Well, we'd have to change the time because it'd be 2 a.m. in the morning. But this is the sort of thing, and you can slice it for different opportunities that we have. So I think when we try and think about bridging the gaps, let's be more creative in the way that we do that.
I think that's great advice.
Yeah.
I think that's something that's certainly, I know it's on the Dean of the LBJ School's agenda. It's something he's put a lot of interest and resources in. It's something at the Strauss Center we want to do, and I think it's absolutely on point. We should be doing this at a time where the people from MGIMO should see it, and any of our other potential partners, and we should be witnessing what they're doing and interacting with them. It's advice well taken. I think we have time for one more quick question. There's a young woman in the back who's been waiting patiently.
Hi, I'm a first-year graduate student at LBJ School. Okay. First-year graduate student at LBJ School as well. I'm doing a dual master's in the School of Architecture with Community and Regional Planning. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about interdisciplinary groups. I noticed that, I think it was Admiral Inman mentioned that it's difficult to bring departments together to partner on various programs, whereas in the graduate schools, I think we've had a lot more success with doing interdisciplinary groups. For instance, we're starting a group right now about international development with students from the business school, from the law school, from architecture, from policy. And I feel like if you are willing to include graduate students in this center in more of an active role, then you might have a bit more success with bridging these different disciplines. So just a suggestion, I'd like to hear maybe a few ways in which graduate students would have the opportunity to become more active.
I think you're exactly right. I cannot resist my usual impolitic conclusion that, in fact, I had great success in getting graduate business students to take part and interact with the public affairs and the law students. I was singularly unsuccessful in getting the graduate business school to become engaged and be a partner in the process.
Well, I think one of the goals that Jim and I had in setting up these panels was to hear from you. And I think we've gotten some great ideas, and I think if you could maybe after this is over, share them with Jim Lindsay and myself, and I think this is something we would definitely want to investigate, support, and be part of, just as I think talking to Peter and his ideas about technology are just spot on. This has been a terrific panel, and please join me in thanking our panelists for just a great insight and analysis. I also want to thank everyone for coming out today for what's really our first event, our first real official event, but it's the first of what will be many events. We have one tomorrow at 5 o'clock in the Brown Room of the LBJ Library. We have events coming throughout the weeks. And the best way to find out about us, the best way to find out about our events, the best way to look into ways of participating with us is to go to our website, which is www.robertstrausscenter.org. www.robertstrausscenter.org. We are a startup. We're just beginning. We are completely open to any and all ideas. I think we learned a ton today, and we want to keep hearing from you. And so thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.